Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be discussing the preterite tense in Spanish. My name is Dan, and my colleague Zach, the other Spanish teacher within our high school program, is here to answer any questions you may have throughout or at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to send them in at any time. If you do need to contact us at any time during our regular business hours, Monday through Friday, 9 to 6 Eastern, we have some options on the slide here. You can send in any questions you might have in this area here that you see on your slide right now. So in today's webinar, we will discuss the uses, translations, and types of verbs within the preterite tense. And that will include both regular and a wide variety of many irregular verbs as well. So to begin, we will start by discussing the difference between the preterite, which is a past tense in Spanish, and another past tense known as the imperfect tense. The preterite is used to express actions that are completed that were not ongoing or repeated in the past, which is what the imperfect is indeed used for, those ongoing or repeated past actions. And both of these tenses, focusing strictly on preterite now for this webinar for today's discussion, they're both simple tenses, which means their conjugations individually are made up of only one word. And you'll see that as we go through the upcoming slides and discussion today. Okay, so here we're going to discuss the translation, the way that the preterite tense sounds from Spanish to English. And it's all very verb dependent. There is not one set or clear-cut translation. It all depends on the verbs, as you can see in the examples here. They all look and sound unique and unlike the rest shown. So words like ate and drank and went and saw all can be considered preterite conjugations if they did only occur, let's say, once or are completed, were not ongoing or repeated. But there's nothing like the future tense has, where the word will comes into play and clearly identifies it as future. Preterite is different in that regard. Even the imperfect can be different in that regard. Words like was or were, eating or drinking, etc., give it away that it is indeed a form of an imperfect tense. So we're going to start the verb discussion or verb portion of this webinar by looking into regular verbs first and foremost and how to conjugate them. And remember, a conjugation is when a subject and a verb are in agreement. As we saw on the previous slide, I, subject, ate, verb. When those things agree, you have what's called a conjugation, as opposed to an infinitive verb, which starts with the word to. To eat is an infinitive. Okay, for now, we're going to focus on conjugations of regular preterite tense verbs. And in order to do that, in order to achieve that subject-verb agreement, there is a two-step process that you must follow in order to conjugate a regular verb. The first of which is that you would drop the infinitive ending, the AR, the ER, or the IR, leaving the stem of the verb. So everything before the AR, ER, IR is known as the stem. And in order to conjugate appropriately to the preterite, you must then add the endings you see in the charts below at the bottom of the screen to that stem, whether it's an AR verb, which has its own set of endings on the left, or it's an ER or IR verb, which have their own set of endings on the right. And if you notice, as the note says there after step 2, there will be accents on first and third singular in each of the charts and nowhere else within those charts. And that applies to all verbs that are considered regular. We'll do a few examples here. And just before we move on to pronounce those endings properly, on the left side you have a, aste, o, amos, and aron. On the right side, iste, io, imos, and ieron. Okay, so on this slide you see a few examples of regular preterite tense verbs conjugated. AR, ER, and IR in that order, with the examples hablar, comer, and escribir. Okay, so the top one should have its own set of endings that we saw on the left side of the previous slide. And the middle and the bottom, comer and escribir, since they're ER, IR verbs, they share that one set of endings different from the previous verb. Those would be the endings we saw on the right side of the previous slide. Okay, so all we've done here is we remove the AR, the ER, and the IR from each of the verbs respectively, and then attach the new endings to the stem. HABL being the first stem, COM, the second verb stem, and ESCRIB, the stem of the last verb. Okay, one unusual thing about preterite first plural, just to follow up on the previous couple of slides, is that the AR ending is the same as it would be in the present indicative tense. So the AMOS is exactly the same as you can see in some of the examples here. All right, and a way to identify or to discern between the present or the preterite would be context clues. Okay, and context clues are things that give away which tense is being expressed. Words, other words around before or after the verb conjugation that identify which time or tense is being referred to. Okay, so in the middle you can see how the conjugations look alike, and it would be hard to just translate hablamos or escribimos without any clues. But our bottom examples here are showing you some of those clues, those context clues. All right, the first is an example of the preterite tense. For a word rather like ayer, meaning yesterday, clearly states that yesterday we spoke. Would not make sense to say yesterday we speak. And then in your second example for the present, ahora, the word for now, clearly tells you that we're referring to the present time, current time, not a past time. So now we speak, or now we are speaking. Okay, so those two words sometimes are important to help pick out which tense is being expressed and to translate appropriately. Okay, so besides those three verbs, hablar, comer, and escribir, there are many other regular verbs within the preterite and within all tenses. Okay, but if you do know that it is regular, follow those steps as we've outlined previously to conjugate appropriately. Okay, as we continue, we're going to move on to our discussion of irregular verbs, and this is where there's going to be quite a lot of detail, right? A lot of different groups, a lot of different irregularities within the tense. One of the good things about the irregular verbs in the preterite is that most of the groups are there's not a whole lot of diversity. They're very closed, quote unquote, meaning there's only one or two verbs that follow these rules in a good portion of these. All right, not a whole lot in comparison to the vast amount of regular verbs that do exist. Okay, so keep in mind that some of the conjugations we're going to refer to here may include partial regular conjugations, but the good majority of them will be irregular, right, or partially or completely irregular. So we're going to break these down into groups by name, and you'll have a good number of groups here, about 8 or 9, as we move forward through the upcoming slides. So the first irregular group is known as the ir-ser group, and that's because the only two verbs within this group are those ir and ser. Ir meaning to go, ser meaning to be. Just by looking at them, the nature of those verbs being 2 and 3 letters total should be a good clue as to why they are considered irregular. All right, and the unique thing about these is that they do share the same conjugation. Again, context clues are going to be what helps you determine which of the verbs is being expressed. So they're quite unusual. They all begin with F's. They have no accents anywhere throughout their conjugations. So to say something like I went, as you can see in the example below, it would be yo fui. Okay, that implication of preterite tense tells you that I went to the store maybe just once today or once last week. It was not a repeated thing. I didn't go there more than once. Okay, and oftentimes a lot of people mistranslate that sentence to say that I was at the store, but that's not a possibility in this context because estar would be the verb to use for location, not ir or ser. And then that second example there, typically if you're referring to ser in the preterite, unfortunately it has to do with a reference to somebody who may no longer be with us, somebody who has passed away. So to talk about somebody who you knew a long time ago or knew for a long time but has passed away, to say he was a nice man, él fue simpático. In that case, ser is being used. Would it make sense to say he went nice? Okay, so quite strange that two verbs can share the same conjugation, but that's what makes them irregular. That's why we separate them and discuss them together away from the other verbs. As we continue, again, we talk about irregular verbs, this being the ver group. Ver, the verb to see or to watch, is the only verb in this group, the only verb that takes regular endings with no accent marks whatsoever. So if you were to compare that to the conjugation of comer that we had earlier on a few slides back, same exact thing, same endings, but comer would need accent marks because it is regular. Ver, for whatever reason, does not take accent marks. So V and VO, where they would normally be, the accents are not present here, making this slightly irregular. Again, viste, vimos, and vieron are regular. Like I mentioned, as we introduced irregular verbs, some of these will include partial regular conjugations as well, unlike ir and ser, which were completely irregular. Okay, so you would use this verb when talking about, the fact that somebody saw or watched a show, movies, etc. Something, like sports off of a television set or a movie screen or computer screen. Okay, another verb that is in its own group is the verb dar. And this one's a little bit unusual. The verb dar means to give. It is the only verb in the preterite that takes opposite, quote-unquote, endings. So that means it's an AR verb, but it takes the ER-IR endings. And if you notice, there are no accents on this group's verbs either, this group's conjugations. So normally, if that was a regular verb, the ending for first person singular would be the letter E with an accent over it. Not in this case. The only verb that takes opposite, meaning AR verb that takes ER-IR endings, no accents. So I gave D, you gave diste, so on and so forth. Quite unusual. Again, irregular in every person. Okay, and again, the only verb in this group. As we move on, the next group is known as the irregular stem group. Okay, so the title should help give it away. We've talked about stems previously in this webinar. The stem would be the letters, that the verb is made up of, everything except for the ER, IR, or AR ending. Okay, and there are 11 in total, which we're going to talk about shortly. And that, in this case, their stems have an unusual or an irregular spelling and require the use of this one set of unique endings that you see on the slide in front of you. These endings do not have accents, as you can tell. And if you notice, they're a little bit of a combination of the AR versus the ER-IR charts from the regular groups. First and third singular take those regular endings without accents, E and O. And second singular, first plural, and third plural take the ER-IR endings, the ISTE, the IMOS, and the IERON. And this set of endings is only used for the 11 verbs we're going to discuss on the next two slides. So keep those in mind as we move forward to talk about these 11 and do some examples. All right, so the first 4 of the 11 irregular stem verbs are seen here on this slide. Looking at andar to begin with, the verb that means to walk or to go. Normally, if andar was to be regular in any tense, and would be its stem. But in the preterite tense, it is irregular. So for this particular verb, you're going to add these 2 letters, U, V, to the stem. So I'm just going to take a step back for a moment. After I discuss this quickly, think about that stem anduve. If you were to say that I walked somewhere, you would use that E ending, anduve. And imagine the rest of those endings being added to this stem. You walked, anduviste. He or she walked, anduvo. We walked, anduvimos. And they walked, anduvieron. Okay, that one set of endings from the slide I just switched back from is used for all 11 of the verbs within this group. We'll see the remaining 7 on the next slide. Okay, so definitely a good list, or 2 lists here, the first 4 and the next 7, to keep in mind, to be mindful of as you start to use preterite throughout your program. Okay, and the other 7 are shown here, poder all the way down to hacer. And if you notice, hacer is out of order. It's not listed alphabetically as the other 10 were, because it's a little bit unusual. It's even more irregular than the rest. And that's because, as you notice on the 3rd column, it actually has 2 irregular stems. HIC, pronounced is, would be used in every person except for 3rd singular. And HIZ, is used only in 3rd singular. And I believe you're going to see that verb conjugated on the next slide as our example. Okay, so there it is. The verb hacer means to do or to make. If you notice, as we just discussed at the bottom of that previous slide, HIC is its irregular stem in every person except 3rd singular. And then in yellow there, you see how it changes just for this particular verb to a Z, from a Z to a C. A C to a Z, rather. Okay, again, no accents. That's the set of endings we had when I introduced this group. Ise, 1st singular, and iso, 3rd singular. Take those AR endings, quote unquote. And the other 3, hiciste, hicimos, and hicieron, take the ER-IR endings. Okay, so again, quite unusual, very, very much irregular. Okay, as we move forward, we're going to move into the next group. Don't confuse the title of this group with the title of the group we just previously discussed. All right, now we're going to refer to stem-changing verbs. Okay, not irregular stems. There is a difference. Okay, these verbs have a vowel in their stem that undergoes a spelling change. Just a vowel, not a couple of letters like you saw in the previous group. And unlike other tenses such as present indicative, in the preterite, there are only 2 types of stem changes. An E to I stem change, as in the verb pedir, and an O to U stem change as the only other type, as in the verb dormir. And to make it a little bit, or to take it a little bit further, a little bit different in comparison to something like present indicative, stem changes in the preterite only occur in IR verbs, specifically and only in 3rd person singular or plural, meaning the other persons use regular conjugations and regular accents. However, AR and ER verbs do not stem change in the preterite. So no AR, ER verbs can be considered stem changing verbs within the preterite tense. Okay, so as we move forward, you'll see a couple of examples, one of each of the 2 types, the 2 example verbs we had on the previous slide. Pedir is our example of E to I. It means to ask for or to request. Okay, and as you see the stem change in yellow, the E has turned to an I after the P. That's what it means to be a stem changing verb. And if you notice, regular endings do apply with regular accents. Same goes for our second verb, dormir, which means to sleep. If you notice, there's an O to U stem change, again in the yellow, in third person singular and third person plural only. And just like the verb above, regular endings for ER, IR verbs with regular accents on first and third singular. Okay, there are quite a few other stem changing verbs that you'll come across, as you go through your program, but for now, for time's sake, these are just the first few introductory example verbs. As we move forward into our next irregular group, we have what is known as the Y group. Okay, this is not an irregular stem. Sorry for that typo. All right, it is just the Y group. And in this case, okay, you have verbs that undergo an I to Y change, I to Y spelling change, in third person singular and plural. And you'll see that more clearly explained as we get into some examples here. All right, within this group, there are accents applied to all persons except for third plural. So the bottom right portion of your conjugation charts will not have an accent mark. And the four main examples of this type of verb are caer, to fall, creer, to believe, leer, to read, and oír, to hear or listen. If you notice, they all have that Y sound in their pronunciation. Caer, creer, leer, and oír. Okay. So let's take a look at an example of the Y group. The verb leer, which means to read. Okay, if you notice, first and foremost, there is your I to Y change in third singular and plural in the yellow, where an I normally is. It has been replaced by a Y. And then the second important thing to factor in, as we mentioned on the previous slide, would be that presence of an accent mark everywhere except third plural. All of the verbs in this group, caer, creer, oír, would also look very much like these conjugations. Crei versus lei, creo versus leo, so on and so forth. Same accent rules, same spelling changes for all of the verbs that are considered Y groups. Okay, as we move on, now we'll discuss the J group verbs. Okay, the verbs in this group share a set of endings that start with the letter J, and there are no accent marks in any person for this group. And the two example verbs that we'll discuss here, as you can see, the verb traer, to bring, and decir, to say or to tell. Right, there's something a little bit unusual about decir that you will see on the next slide as far as how to conjugate it appropriately. Not only is it in the J group, but it also takes a bit of a stem change, quote unquote. All right, so here are the examples. If you notice where the J is in all of these conjugations, those are your J group endings. So endings like he, the JE, histe, ho, himos, and heron. All right, they are shared amongst these two verbs conjugations. And if you notice, as I mentioned previously about decir, the E becomes an I. So those conjugations would be pronounced dihe, I said or I told, dijiste, dijo, dijimos, dijeron. No sort of unusual quote-unquote stem or spell change for traer. You just simply remove the infinitive ending and add the J endings from there. Okay, not too many verbs are considered J group verbs. Right? These are probably the only two you'll probably come across within your Penn Foster Spanish program. However, you will see other verbs that do take J group endings, not considered part of the J group though. And those are verbs that end in UCIR. Okay, so verbs that end in this four-letter combination also use the J group endings from the previous group, still don't have any accents on any person. And what happens here is a verb like traducir, to translate, a verb like conducir, to drive. You're now going to remove the CIR, leaving everything up until and including the U. And then you would apply the J endings from there. And you'll see that in our examples on the next slide, rather. Okay, so a verb like traducir, remove the CIR, keep the U attached with the rest of the stem, and then apply the J group endings. So to say I translated, traduje. You translated, tradujiste. If you go down to the bottom, I drove, conduje, you drove, condujiste, so on and so forth. All right, so basically any verb that ends in that four-letter combination would follow these rules. J group endings, no accents, keep the U attached, and then add the J endings there. Okay, and our final irregular verb group within the preterite tense would be the car, gar, and zar group. All right, any verb that ends in car, gar, or zar would fit into this category. And what happens here is you have, again, a bit of a spell change. But for this particular group, the spell change, the irregularity, only occurs in first person singular, which means the rest of the conjugations are regular, and they would follow the regular rules that we started our discussion on verbs with much earlier throughout this webinar. So those changes are as follows, as you can see on the bottom part of the slide. If a verb is CAR, when you conjugate in first singular, the C changes to a QU. But the C remains in every other person, making those other persons regular, as you see above. GAR verbs, the G changes to GU, first singular only, keep the G alone in the rest of the conjugation. And then ZAR verbs undergo a Z to C change in first singular only. All right, and keep the Z in the other persons. And you'll see some examples of these verbs here on this slide. Okay, a verb like sakar, to take, whether it's to take an exam, to take out the trash, etc., to take a photo. Okay, if you notice that C has changed to QU, as we talked about on the previous slide, only in the yellow, only in first person singular. After that, the rest of the conjugation is completely regular, spelling and accent, both. A verb like pagar, to pay for something, the G adds that U in first singular only in the yellow, but no U in the remaining portion of that chart. Completely regular endings with regular accents in the other persons. And then a verb like empezar, to begin or to start, the Z changes to a C in first singular, as you can see in the yellow, but only there. And then the Z remains, making the rest of the chart a regular conjugation. So this is quite a lot of information, very important information, stuff that you'll be using throughout your program, that we recommend you, keep handy, because it will start to get a little bit more confusing, as you start to learn more and more verbs. Okay. So that concludes today's webinar. We do thank you for your attention. We wish you the best of luck, buena suerte, in your Spanish program. If you do need us, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you at any point throughout your program with any questions you might have. If you do have any questions about today's webinar, you can feel free to send those in right now, and Zach will be happy to answer those for you. All right, thank you, and good luck.